The easiest things to throw away are often the ones that could have changed your life. On a windy Thursday afternoon in downtown Chicago, Christian Hayes walked out of the towering glass headquarters of Hayes Global with the measured confidence of a man who believed every second had a price. At 41, he had built a billion-dollar logistics empire from relentless discipline, impossible standards, and the unwavering belief that emotions only slowed successful people down. His tailored charcoal overcoat moved gently in the cold breeze as his security team kept a respectful distance, knowing their CEO preferred silence to conversation. Outside the building, the sidewalks buzzed with office workers carrying coffee cups, tourists snapping pictures beneath towering skyscrapers, and taxis weaving through late afternoon traffic. The city felt alive, yet Christian barely noticed any of it. His attention stayed fixed on tomorrow's acquisition meeting, next quarter's projections, and the endless stream of decisions waiting on his desk. Then a tiny voice interrupted the rhythm of his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir?" He almost kept walking. Almost. Standing beside the polished granite steps was a little girl no older than 8. She wore a light blue coat that had clearly been patched with careful hands, white sneakers that had seen better days, and neatly braided blonde hair that framed a pair of calm blue eyes far older than her age should have allowed. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't crying. She simply held out a white envelope with both hands as though it contained something precious. "I wrote this for you," she said with quiet certainty. Christian accepted the envelope only because refusing it seemed like it would take even longer. He glanced at the front. In uneven pencil letters it read, "For Mr. Christian Hayes." No company logo. No return address. No request stamped across the outside. Just his name, written with the careful concentration only a child could give. He turned the envelope over once, expression unreadable. Behind him, his assistant reminded him softly that they were already running 5 minutes behind schedule. Christian sighed almost imperceptibly. Without opening the envelope, he stepped toward the brushed steel trash can beside the entrance and dropped it inside. The paper landed with barely a sound. "I'm sorry," he said in a voice as polished as the building behind him. "I don't read personal letters." The little girl didn't argue. She didn't chase after the envelope. She simply looked at the trash can for a long moment before lifting her eyes back to him. There was disappointment there, but somehow not surprise. "Okay," she answered gently. Then she turned and walked away into the crowd, disappearing between strangers carrying shopping bags and umbrellas until Christian could no longer see the light blue coat. Within seconds he had forgotten her, or at least he believed he had. 3 days later, on a bright Sunday morning, Christian arrived at his office expecting another quiet weekend of uninterrupted work. As he stepped from the elevator, he noticed someone sitting patiently on the marble bench across from the reception desk. The same light blue coat, the same neatly braided blonde hair, the same little white face looking toward him with steady, fearless eyes. Lily Parker stood as soon as she saw him. She wasn't holding another envelope. She folded her small hands together and waited until he stopped only a few feet away. Then, with the calm honesty that only children seem capable of carrying, she asked one simple question that instantly made the entire building feel impossibly quiet. "Mr. Hayes, if you never wanted to know what I wrote, why did you throw it away instead of giving it back to me?" Christian Hayes had answered questions from investors worth billions of dollars without blinking. Yet somehow the quiet voice standing before him demanded an answer he did not have. For a long moment he simply looked at Lily Parker, searching her face for anger, disappointment, or accusation. Instead, he found only patience. It unsettled him far more than tears ever could have. Around them, the reception area glowed beneath tall windows that overlooked the Chicago skyline. Sunlight reflected across polished marble floors, untouched leather chairs, and walls decorated with awards, celebrating innovation and leadership. Everything inside Hayes Global had been designed to communicate certainty, precision, and control. Yet none of those things seemed to matter while one little girl waited for a simple explanation. Christian finally cleared his throat. "Because I did not think it mattered." The words sounded colder once they left his mouth. Lily lowered her eyes for just a second before looking back at him. "How can you know something does not matter if you never read it?" The question settled into the silence between them. His assistant shifted uncomfortably, pretending to organize a folder that clearly needed no organizing. Even the security guard near the entrance seemed unsure whether to look away. Christian had built an entire career making decisions in seconds. Speed was strength. Hesitation cost money. Emotion clouded judgment. Those principles had transformed a struggling freight company into one of the largest logistics corporations in the country. Employees admired him because he never hesitated. Competitors feared him because he never looked back. Yet standing before Lily, certainty suddenly felt strangely incomplete. "People send letters every day," he replied. "Most of them want something." Lily nodded thoughtfully, as though she genuinely considered his answer instead of preparing to challenge it. "Maybe," she said softly. "But not everybody wants money." Christian folded his arms. "Then what did you want?" A small smile appeared on her face, not because she had won an argument, but because he had finally asked the question she had hoped to hear 3 days earlier. "You would have known if you read it." The words lingered in the bright lobby like a melody refusing to fade. Christian glanced toward the reception desk where his calendar waited, packed with conference calls, financial reports, and executive meetings scheduled down to the minute. None of them suddenly felt as urgent as they had an hour ago. "I cannot read it now," he said quietly. "It is gone." Lily nodded again, accepting the truth without complaint. "I know." She reached into the pocket of her blue coat, but instead of pulling out another envelope, she simply wrapped both hands around something unseen and kept it there. "I did not come back because of the letter," she said. "I came back because I wanted to understand." Christian frowned slightly. Understand what? Why someone everyone says is so important did not have 30 seconds for another person. The sentence was spoken gently, almost curiously, without blame or resentment. Somehow that made it impossible to dismiss. Christian found himself looking beyond the little girl toward the steel trash can that had already been emptied days ago. It looked ordinary now, just another polished object in an immaculate building. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he could still picture the white envelope disappearing inside it. It was only paper, he reminded himself. Only paper. But for the first time in many years, he realized that perhaps it had never been about the paper at all. Lily slowly opened her hands and revealed a folded sheet of notebook paper, its edges slightly worn but carefully protected as though it carried something far more valuable than ink. Christian stared at it without reaching forward. "This is not the first letter," she said. "The first one is gone. This one is different." He remained silent. She stepped one pace closer and held the paper where he could see it clearly. "I will not ask you to read it now," she continued. "I only want you to decide if you are throwing it away before you know what it says." Those words settled heavily inside him. For reasons he could not explain, his hand refused to move. Every instinct told him to decline politely, return to work, and leave this strange encounter behind. That was what the old Christian Hayes would have done without a second thought. Yet something about the calm certainty in Lily's voice made walking away feel unusually difficult. "What if I still choose not to read it?" he asked. Lily smiled gently. "Then at least you decided after thinking instead of before." Christian looked at the paper again. It was ordinary notebook paper, folded neatly into thirds without an envelope this time. No ribbon, no decoration, just careful pencil marks barely visible along the crease. His assistant quietly stepped back, sensing that whatever was happening no longer belonged to business schedules or executive meetings. The lobby became strangely peaceful. The distant sound of elevators opening and closing blended with the soft hum of air conditioning, but neither of them seemed to notice. Christian finally accepted the folded page, holding it between two fingers as though it weighed almost nothing. Somehow it felt surprisingly heavy. "You spent 3 days writing another one?" he asked. Lily shook her head. "No, I spent 3 days deciding if I should come back." He looked up. "Why did you?" Her answer arrived without hesitation. "Because my teacher says people are more than the worst decision they have ever made." Christian felt something shift quietly inside his chest. No executive had ever spoken to him that way. No investor had ever measured him by anything except results. Yet this little girl had just offered him something he had not realized he needed, the possibility that one mistake did not have to become part of his identity forever. He glanced at the folded paper resting in his hand. "Did your teacher help you write this?" Lily laughed softly and shook her head again. "No. She only told me that honest words sound better when they belong to the person saying them." Christian almost smiled before catching himself. It had been so long since a conversation had wandered somewhere without contracts, negotiations, or numbers that he had nearly forgotten what curiosity felt like. "Then tell me one thing," he said quietly. "If you wanted me to read your first letter so badly, why did you not simply tell me what it said?" Lily looked through the tall windows toward the bright Chicago skyline before answering. "Because some things lose their meaning if somebody else has to read them for you." Christian lowered his eyes to the paper once more. His thumb rested against the folded edge, tempted to open it immediately. Instead, he slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of his overcoat. Lily noticed the gesture and smiled, not because he had read it, but because this time he had chosen not to throw it away. As she turned toward the revolving doors, she paused one final time. "Do not wait too long, Mr. Hayes," she said softly. "Sometimes the hardest letters to read are the ones we already carry inside ourselves." Then she walked into the morning sunlight, leaving Christian standing motionless in the center of the immaculate lobby, his carefully planned day suddenly feeling less important than a single folded piece of paper resting over his heart. Christian did not open the folded page that morning. He carried it through every meeting like an unanswered question tucked inside his coat. Executives presented charts filled with rising revenue, expanding markets, and ambitious forecasts, but for the first time in years his attention drifted. Every few minutes, he found himself touching the inside pocket almost unconsciously, confirming the paper was still there. Late that afternoon, after the last conference room had emptied and the building settled into its familiar weekend quiet, he stood alone inside his office overlooking the Chicago River. The city below shimmered beneath the fading light. Boats moved slowly across the water. Office windows reflected streaks of orange and gold. Normally, this view reminded him how far he had come. Today it only reminded him how high above everyone else he had allowed himself to live. He removed the folded sheet from his pocket and placed it carefully on the walnut desk. For several long moments, he simply looked at it. It would have been easy to leave it unopened until Monday. Easier still to throw it away and return to the predictable rhythm of numbers and deadlines. Instead, he slowly unfolded the paper along its careful creases. The handwriting was small, steady, and unmistakably written by a child who had erased several words before deciding they were finally right. There was no request for money, no appeal for sympathy, only a single paragraph. "Dear Mr. Hayes, my teacher says people become important because they help other people feel seen. I wanted to know if that was true. I thought maybe if someone important read something I wrote, then maybe my words mattered too. Thank you for taking the time if you do." Christian read the lines once, then again, then a third time. The room remained perfectly silent except for the distant hum of traffic 30 floors below. He realized with growing discomfort that the little girl had never asked him for anything except his attention. She had measured his kindness in seconds rather than dollars. Slowly he leaned back in his chair, allowing memories he had ignored for decades to rise without resistance. He remembered being 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a handwritten essay clutched tightly in his hands, waiting for his father to come home. He had wanted nothing more than someone to read it. His father had arrived late, exhausted from work, glanced at the pages, and said there would be time another day. Another day had never come. Christian closed his eyes. He had spent his entire adult life believing efficiency protected people from disappointment. Somewhere along the way, he had unknowingly become the very person he once promised himself he would never resemble. He folded Lily's letter with far greater care than before and placed it inside the top drawer of his desk instead of hiding it away. Then he pressed the intercom. His assistant answered almost immediately. "Emily, could you help me find someone?" There was a brief pause. "Of course, sir. Who are we looking for?" Christian looked once more at the neat handwriting resting before him. "A little girl named Lily Parker," he said quietly. "I think I owe her more than an answer. I think I owe her my time." Ironically, finding Lily Parker proved far more difficult than closing a multi-million-dollar acquisition. Emily searched every visitor record from the previous week, contacted nearby elementary schools, and even called several community centers that partnered with Hayes Global. No one seemed to know an 8-year-old girl who quietly delivered handwritten letters to corporate offices. Christian surprised everyone by asking for updates twice a day. The request itself became the subject of whispered conversations throughout the executive floor. Employees who had worked beside him for years had never seen their reserved chief executive searching for someone with such quiet determination. 3 days later, Emily entered his office, carrying a slim folder instead of her usual stack of financial reports. "I think we found her," she said with a relieved smile. Christian looked up immediately. "She attends Lincoln Community Elementary on the north side. Her teacher remembered your company's name because Lily mentioned visiting your building." Without checking his calendar, Christian stood and reached for his coat. "Cancel my afternoon meetings." Emily blinked in surprise. All of them. All of them." Less than 40 minutes later, his black sedan stopped outside a modest red brick school surrounded by maple trees, beginning to show the first signs of autumn. Children's laughter floated across the playground as classes changed for the afternoon. Christian stepped onto the sidewalk feeling strangely out of place. He had spoken before thousands of shareholders without nervousness, yet walking toward one elementary school entrance somehow felt far more intimidating. Inside the front office, colorful student artwork covered the walls. Construction paper stars, watercolor landscapes, and handwritten stories filled every bulletin board with cheerful imperfections. A receptionist smiled warmly. "May I help you?" Christian introduced himself, expecting the familiar recognition that usually followed his name. Instead, the receptionist simply nodded politely before calling room 12. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 30s appeared wearing a navy cardigan dusted with tiny flecks of chalk. "I am Sarah Collins," she said, extending her hand. "Lily's teacher." Christian thanked her for meeting with him. Mrs. Collins studied him for a moment before leading him into an empty classroom where sunlight poured through wide windows onto rows of small wooden desks. One desk near the back immediately caught his attention. A notebook sat perfectly centered beside a carefully sharpened pencil, and on the corner rested a small stack of folded papers tied together with blue yarn. "That is Lily's desk," Mrs. Collins said softly, noticing where he was looking. "She writes every day." Christian smiled faintly. "She is very thoughtful." Mrs. Collins nodded. "She believes words can help people notice things they usually walk past." The sentence lingered in the quiet classroom. Christian looked around at the walls covered with student essays and colorful reading charts before asking the question that had quietly followed him since opening Lily's letter. "Why did she choose to write to me?" Mrs. Collins smiled gently. "Actually, she wrote several letters." Christian turned toward her with visible surprise. "Several?" "Yes. At the beginning of the semester, I asked my students to write to someone they believed could make the world a little kinder. Some chose firefighters. Some wrote to nurses. One wrote to her grandfather serving overseas. Lily chose you." Christian stared at her without speaking. "Did she know me?" he finally asked. Mrs. Collins shook her head. "Only from newspaper articles and interviews." She told the class that if someone trusted with so much responsibility still believed every person deserved to be heard, then maybe everyone else would too. Christian lowered his eyes, humbled by a version of himself that existed only inside the imagination of one hopeful little girl. Lily was not in the classroom that afternoon. Mrs. Collins explained that every Wednesday she left school early to spend the afternoon at the neighborhood library, a place where she loved to read, write, and help younger children sound out difficult words. Christian thanked the teacher and quietly walked back through the hallway, passing rows of student artwork that suddenly seemed far more meaningful than the framed awards hanging in his own headquarters. Before he reached the front door, Mrs. Collins called his name once more. "There is something else you should know." He turned. She walked over carrying a thin blue folder. "These are copies of some of Lily's classroom assignments. I think they may answer a question you have not asked yet." Christian accepted the folder carefully. Inside were short essays, reading reflections, and handwritten journal pages filled with thoughtful observations that sounded far older than an 8-year-old child. One sentence stopped him completely. "Being noticed is different from being helped. People remember help, but they never forget being seen." Read the line twice before looking up. Mrs. Collins smiled gently. "She writes things like that all the time." Christian could only nod. As he drove back toward downtown Chicago, he found himself reading the pages again whenever the car paused at a traffic light. There were stories about autumn leaves floating along the river, an elderly crossing guard who greeted every child by name, and a librarian who remembered everyone's favorite books without looking at a computer. Lily noticed details most adults hurried past. Late that evening, after the office had emptied once again, Christian remained alone beneath the soft glow of his desk lamp. Instead of reviewing contracts, he spread Lily's school papers beside the second letter and quietly compared the handwriting. Every word carried the same quiet sincerity. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was written to impress. It was simply honest. His eyes drifted toward a framed magazine cover celebrating him as one of the nation's most influential business leaders. For years, he had been proud of that recognition. Tonight, it felt strangely incomplete. He opened a desk drawer and removed an old photograph he had not looked at in years. It showed a much younger Christian standing beside his mother outside a small public library. She had volunteered there every Saturday until illness prevented her from continuing. He remembered how she insisted on learning every child's name before recommending a single book. People read better, she used to tell him, when they believe someone is listening. He had not thought about those words in decades. Somewhere between ambition and achievement, he had forgotten them completely. Christian closed the drawer slowly and looked once more at Lily's writing. She had unknowingly echoed the same lesson his mother had tried to teach him long ago. The realization settled quietly over him, not with guilt alone, but with gratitude. Some lessons returned only after years of silence, carried by voices no one expected. He reached for his phone and called Emily even though the hour was late. She answered with concern. "Is everything all right, sir?" Christian smiled faintly as he looked out across the lights reflecting on the Chicago River. "Yes," he replied softly. "Tomorrow morning, I would like you to clear my schedule for 1 hour." Emily sounded surprised. "Do you have another meeting at the school?" Christian glanced once more at Lily's papers resting neatly across his desk. "No," he answered. "Tomorrow I am going to the library. I think there is still someone I need to learn how to listen to." Late the next morning, Christian arrived at the Lincoln Community Library without a driver opening his door or an assistant walking beside him. He entered quietly, leaving behind the polished world of executive boardrooms for the comforting scent of old books and freshly sharpened pencils. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming rows of wooden shelves where children wandered with stacks of colorful stories tucked against their chests. Soft laughter floated through the reading room, interrupted only by the gentle turning of pages. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move more slowly, inviting people to notice one another instead of rushing past. A librarian recognized him immediately, but greeted him with the same warm smile she offered every visitor. "You must be looking for Lily," she whispered. Christian nodded. She pointed toward a corner filled with beanbag chairs and low bookshelves. There, surrounded by 5 younger children, sat Lily Parker. She was reading aloud from a picture book, changing her voice for every character and pausing patiently whenever one of the children asked a question. Nobody seemed impressed that one of the wealthiest executives in Chicago had just walked into the room. Nobody even looked up. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the little storyteller whose quiet confidence filled the library more completely than the sound of her gentle voice. Christian stood several feet away, unwilling to interrupt. He watched as Lily carefully helped a little boy pronounce a difficult word before encouraging him to try the sentence again on his own. When he finished, she smiled as though he had accomplished something extraordinary. It reminded Christian of something his mother used to do, celebrating effort before perfection. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the reading circle ended. The children thanked Lily one by one and hurried toward the checkout desk carrying their books. Only then did she notice Christian standing nearby. She smiled with genuine surprise. "You came." Christian returned the smile, though his felt unfamiliar after years of being reserved. "I told myself I would." Lily looked at him for a moment before asking, "Did you read it?" He slowly nodded. Every word. She did not ask what he thought. She simply waited. Christian reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed the folded letter, now protected inside a clear plastic document sleeve. "I almost missed this," he admitted quietly. "That would have been my loss." Lily looked at the letter but did not reach for it. "You know," she said softly, "I was never sad because you threw it away." Christian blinked in surprise. "You were not." She shook her head. "I was sad because I thought maybe you threw away everybody's words before hearing them." The honesty of her answer settled deep inside him. "I have done that more times than I care to admit," he confessed. Lily glanced around the library, where families read together beneath bright windows. People do not always need someone to solve their problems, she said. Sometimes they only need someone to stop long enough to say, I heard you. Christian felt the quiet truth of those words more deeply than any leadership seminar or business book had ever reached him. For years he had believed success meant speaking with certainty. Yet standing in that peaceful library beside an 8-year-old girl, he discovered that real influence often began by listening without interruption. He folded the letter carefully once again and looked at Lily with sincere gratitude. Would you be willing, he asked gently, to help me learn how to do that better? Lily smiled with the quiet confidence that had first brought her to his office. Yes, she answered, but only if you promise to read the next letter before deciding what it means. Over the next several weeks, Thursday afternoons quietly became something Christian protected more carefully than any board meeting. While investors waited for conference calls and executives rearranged schedules, he drove across the city to the neighborhood library where Lily always arrived with another folded letter tucked inside her notebook. She never handed it to him immediately. Instead, they spent the first hour walking slowly through the aisles, talking about books, favorite authors, and the surprising places where ordinary people found courage. Sometimes Lily recommended stories written more than 100 years ago. Other times, she chose brand new picture books, whose simple pages somehow carried profound truths. Christian listened far more than he spoke. For the first time in many years, he discovered that silence shared with another person could feel comforting instead of lonely. One Thursday, Lily placed a sealed envelope on the reading table between them. Christian smiled before reaching for it. May I read it now? He asked. She nodded. That is the promise. He opened the letter carefully, unfolding each crease with the same respect he once reserved only for contracts. Inside, the handwriting was as steady as ever. Dear Mr. Hayes, today I learned that libraries lend books because someone believes strangers can be trusted. I wonder if people can do that too. Maybe trust grows one page at a time. Christian lowered the page slowly. You always write about things everyone sees, but almost nobody notices, he said quietly. Lily shrugged with a gentle smile. Maybe they are too busy looking for bigger things. Her answer stayed with him long after he returned downtown. The next Monday morning, Hayes Global held its monthly leadership meeting. Executives entered expecting another discussion about expansion strategies and quarterly performance. Instead, Christian began by placing a blank sheet of paper in front of every person at the table. Curious glances moved around the room. Before we discuss business, he said calmly, I want each of you to write the name of one employee whose ideas you have never truly listened to. The room fell silent. No charts appeared on the large presentation screens. No financial projections filled the walls. Only quiet reflection. Several executives looked uncomfortable. Others stared thoughtfully at the empty pages before slowly beginning to write. Christian realized he was asking them to confront the same habit he had finally recognized within himself. Later that afternoon, he introduced a simple change throughout the company. Every month, employees at every level would have an opportunity to submit handwritten suggestions, stories, or concerns directly to leadership. Each one would receive a personal response. Some executives questioned whether the process would consume too much time. Christian answered without hesitation. If people are worth employing, they are worth hearing. As the weeks passed, hundreds of letters began arriving. Some contained practical ideas that improved daily operations. Others shared personal stories of encouragement, gratitude, and hope. Christian read every single one. Occasionally, he stayed in his office long after sunset, not because another business deal demanded his attention, but because someone had trusted him enough to place honest words on paper. Every Thursday, he returned to the library with another stack of completed replies. Lily never asked how many letters he had answered. She simply noticed that his eyes looked lighter than they had the day they first met. One afternoon, she smiled and said, You are reading people now, not just pages. Christian looked around the peaceful library filled with families, children, and quiet conversations before smiling back. I think, he admitted softly, that has become the most important education of my life. 1 year later, the lobby of Hayes Global looked almost exactly the same, yet everything important had changed. The polished marble still reflected the morning sunlight. The glass walls still overlooked the Chicago skyline. Executives still hurried through the entrance carrying briefcases and coffee cups. But beside the reception desk now stood a handcrafted wooden mailbox with a simple brass plaque that read, "Every letter matters." There was no lock on the front because it was never meant to keep people out. It existed to invite them in. Employees, interns, visitors, and children from local schools quietly slipped handwritten notes inside every day. Some offered ideas. Some shared dreams. Some simply thanked someone who had made them feel seen. Christian Hayes insisted on reading every letter himself before passing them to the appropriate department. It took hours each week, but he never once described the time as wasted. One crisp autumn afternoon, Lincoln Community Elementary held its annual student writing celebration at the neighborhood library. Families filled every chair while colorful artwork lined the walls. Mrs. Collins welcomed everyone before inviting Lily Parker to the front of the room. She walked confidently to the small wooden podium with a folded piece of paper in her hands. Christian sat quietly in the last row exactly as he had promised months earlier. He did not sponsor the event. He did not stand at the microphone. He did not seek recognition. He simply came to listen. Lily looked around the room before beginning to read. Her voice remained calm, warm, and steady. She spoke about how words could become bridges when people chose to cross them instead of walking away. She wrote that kindness often began with attention, not money, and that listening could change two lives at the same time, the person speaking and the person willing to hear. When she finished, the room remained silent for a heartbeat before warm applause filled every corner of the library. Christian stood with everyone else, clapping until his hands ached. Their eyes met across the room, and neither of them needed to say a single word. They both remembered a different day, a different letter, and a different version of the man standing there. After the celebration ended, Lily walked over carrying another folded page. Christian laughed softly. "Another letter?" She nodded. "Yes, but this one is easy." He opened it immediately. Inside were only two short sentences. "Thank you for reading the first one in your heart, even after it was gone." Some stories begin when people finally decide to listen. Christian folded the page carefully and placed it beside the first letter, both protected inside the same leather folder he now carried almost everywhere. Looking out the library window toward the golden leaves drifting across the sidewalk, he realized the greatest investment he had ever made had not been in buildings, companies, or markets. It had been in slowing down long enough to hear one quiet voice. Years from now, people would remember Christian Hayes as an extraordinary business leader, but those who truly knew him understood something even more important. His greatest success began the moment he stopped measuring the value of a person before hearing the value of their words. And somewhere on a bookshelf inside that peaceful little library, another blank notebook waited for Lily Parker, ready to hold the next letter that might quietly change someone else's life. Because true wealth is never measured by what we keep, but by how deeply we choose to listen.